Recording now. Hafaday, talofa lava. Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Support from the Office of Insular Affairs for Native Communities in the Pacific Territories of America, Samoa, Guam, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas Islands, featuring the Office of Insular Affairs. My name is Matthew Kaulana Ng, and on behalf of the Administration for Native Americans Pacific Region Training and Technical Assistance Center, I'd like to welcome you all to the session today to learn more about the support available to the Native peoples in ANA and all of the communities that we serve, including those in the insular areas of Guam, Saipan, Tinian, Rota, and America, Samoa. Now, before we get started, I'd like to offer a small traditional pule to set our intentions for the day. This is a prayer that I was taught that speaks to the continuity of knowledge and responsibility from land to man, from generation to generation. Just a way that we at ANA like to open up our sessions following the traditional protocol of our hosts. And it's called Pule na Kupuna. E na kupuna o Hawaii, mai ka manawa wa ke aia manawa. Ke kūnei mākou makapoʻohiwi o papa. Ua hānau ia mākou mai a papa mai a hoi hoi a papa. Nā mākou e mālama i nā iwi o ko mākou kupuna, nā moʻo e mālama i ko mākou iwi. A hoʻomau ka lokahi o kākou. No laila, e ho mai ka ike, e ho mai ka noʻeau, e ho mai ke aloha, e ho mai ka ikaika. A mama ua no. Mahalo everyone for joining and setting our intentions together. Now, before we get into today's core presentation, I'd like to introduce ANA Deputy Commissioner Hope McDonald Lone Tree, who will be providing some opening remarks on behalf of ANA. Hope McDonald Lone Tree serves as the Deputy Commissioner at the Administration for Native Americans and currently fills the role of Commissioner. Previously, Hope served 2 four-year terms as a councilwoman on the 20th and 21st Navajo Nation Councils and works in the Office of the Speaker of the 24th Navajo Nation and worked in the Office of the Speaker in the 24th Navajo Nation Council on issues including public safety, public health, and veterans. The Deputy Commissioner brings to ANA a wealth of knowledge and experience in tribal and government affairs and criminal justice issues, having served as a tribal relations advisor for the U.S. Department of Justice, co-chair of DOJ's Office of Justice Programs Tribal Justice Advisory Group, and a member of the U.S. Attorney General's Tribal Nations Leadership Council, advancing her advocacy for victims of crime, restorative justice, and improving federal response. Hope is also an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation, and we are very thankful to have Hope to offer some opening remarks on behalf of ANA. So I'll hand it over to you, Hope.
Okay. Mahalo, Matt, and aloha, everyone. And I want to say good afternoon and probably good morning to many of you. Welcome and thank you for giving me the opportunity to introduce ANA and the amazing work that we are doing to support Indigenous communities. Just a little bit of background on ANA, if you have not heard about us previously. We were created in 1974 with the enactment of the Native American Programs Act, which we call NAPA, with the mission to improve the economic and social well-being of Native American communities. ANA supports tribal sovereign self-sufficiency by providing grant funding and training and technical assistance to federally recognized Native American tribal governments and Native organizations across the United States, including Guam, Samoa, and the Northern Mariana Islands, and Hawaii, of course. In fiscal year 21, we provided approximately $19.9 million to community-based projects across ANA's 3 main programs: the Social and Economic Development Strategies, Native American Language Preservation and Maintenance, Environmental Regulatory Enhancement. This year, we have some strategic goals based on the administration's priorities as well as the Tribal Advisory Council, who provides some guidance to ANA. And they include advanced economic opportunity, mobility, and quality of life for Indigenous communities through interagency collaboration. The second is advanced prevention of the factors that contribute to missing and murdered Indigenous peoples. And that's also through collaborative implementation of the White House Executive Order on improving public safety and criminal justice for Native Americans and addressing the crisis of MMIP. We continually, in an ongoing basis, provide policy review and commentary on ways to address MMIP, intersections and homelessness and risk of homelessness in our Indigenous communities. Third, we also advance the behavioral health of tribal children, youth, and families by strengthening linkages between behavioral health, health and human services in our Indigenous communities. So as many of you may know, our 2022 NOFOs are out. And so for our SEDS, we have about 13.2 million, Esther Martinez, 4.5, and environmental regulatory enhancement is 1.2, all totaling around 19 million for our grants that are coming up. The deadlines are coming up very, very quick. For our preservation and maintenance, the deadline is March 31st for our language grants. SEDS, our economic development grants, is April 15th. So if you have any questions, I encourage you to reach out to us as soon as possible so that we can get you connected with our TA providers. And Matt is a wonderful and dynamic resource for us in the Pacific. So I appreciate him coordinating this as well. We have various grants, and I just kind of want to give you a glimpse of what we currently fund in fiscal year 21 in the Pacific communities. They include for SEDS, our economic development strategies, the Feed Our Villages, Feed Our Futures, and this serves Native Chamorro farmers and people of Guam. And then we also have the, I'm gonna really, I hope I don't ruin these names totally, but it's Tauto Tasi, Maritime Career Pathways. They are providing training and education and leading to culturally and financial rewarding jobs in the maritime professions. In Saipan, we have the Lemai May Nonprofit Incubator. This project establishes nonprofit incubator and focuses on developing a customized nonprofit mentoring and support program. We also have is our language programs. In Guam, the developing a bilingual school model for Guam for specific to Chamorro language. And then we also have the, as well in Guam is the, and I'm not going to say this name well, but the Fino Chamorro G Finayakin, which increases the speaking usage and proficiency of non-speaking Chamorro. Maybe I better enroll in that class. And the social and economic development strategies, growing organizations in Guam also includes the Guam Unique Merchandise and Art. And this focuses on expanding the capacity by developing a strategic plan in the 19 villages. Last but not least is, and again, these are a glimpse of what we funded and we currently fund, and this is the In America Samoa Intersections, increases the number of youth leaders who will effectively communicate the benefits of avoiding risky behaviors. We also have the Sanctuary Incorporated of Guam, which promotes cultural language, history, and knowledge. We definitely continue to do outreach, interagency outreach, and we understand the need for multi-agency coordination. And oftentimes we hear a lot about how we're siloed. We really feel that it's important at ANA for us to do multi-agency coordination so that we can bring these programs to you and make sure that we are helping you leverage the resources. We know that there are many issues that are facing your communities, and a multi-agency approach to honor our relationship with our Indigenous communities is very important for ANA. We continue to outreach to federal agency programs for potential collaboration on supporting social and economic well-being for Native American communities. And these outreach include the White House Council on Native American Affairs, Economic Development, MMIP, Education Equity, Veteran Service and Training, the Economic Development at BIA, Treasury, and US DOJ for reentry resources and coordination, just to name a few. We also do outreach to other community organizations so that we can reach the community network out there in your areas. So we look forward to learning and listening more, and where we can have some really good communication and engagement in your communities. The idea is not to bring you to DC, but we want to bring DC to you. So I'm looking forward to the conversations today. I am so thankful that Matt has organized this for us, that we are developing new partnerships. And I just want to thank you again. Mahalo for the opportunity to introduce ANA and the work that we are doing to support your communities in the Pacific. And so thank you again. Matt?
Mahalo, Hope. Thank you for those opening remarks. Some of the projects she named are just a few of the 12 active projects we have currently going on in Guam, CNMI, and America Samoa. Recognize some of you in the attendee list who we have built relationships over the years with, and it's good to see you here as well. So thank you for those opening remarks, Deputy Commissioner. At this time, I'd like to introduce our esteemed guests, our presenters from the Office of Insular Affairs. Like Hope said, so much overlap between the constituencies that we serve. It's really encouraging to see more partnerships like this develop so that we can advance our advocacy for Native and Indigenous peoples in the insular areas, as well as in all of the areas that we both serve. Presenting on behalf of the Office of Insular Affairs will be Deputy Assistant Secretary Keone Nakoa. Keone Nakoa serves as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Insular and International Affairs for the Office of Insular Affairs in the Department of the Interior. Keone joins Interior from the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, where he worked with Congress and federal agencies as the Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief. Keone previously served as speechwriter for the late Senator Daniel Akaka, clerk for the Chief Judge of the Hawaii Intermediate Court of Appeals, and as a lawyer at a private firm in Honolulu. He holds JD and MBA degrees from the University of Hawaii at Manoa and a bachelor's degree in biological anthropology from Harvard University. Born and raised in Honolulu, Hawaii, he is part Native Hawaiian and lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife, Stephanie. And on a personal note, my team and I have been doing this work for 10 years now, and we've seen Mr. Nakoa advocating quietly for Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders in DC, tirelessly over the years, working for the betterment of Native Hawaiians and all Pacific Islanders for a long time. It's always nice to see him when we're up there in DC, always working hard. And when we heard about his new leadership position, we were thrilled as Pacific Islanders. We were proud. And of course, we're grateful that he's willing to spend his time to share what's going on at the Office of Insular Affairs today, as well as the rest of his team who will be joining him as well. So thank you, Deputy Assistant Secretary. I'll pass it over to you now for your presentation.
Mahalo, Matt. It's a pleasure to work with you and your crew, and Keone before you. It's just you folks do so much good for the communities, really bringing voice to the Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians and the diaspora across the United States. So very, very grateful for all that you folks do and trying to increase awareness and driving great programs and resources out to communities who can really use them to do the work that's needed. And so just really briefly, let me say on Hawaii kako o Keone ko'unoa e nu'uanu o nu'uanu e hanau. So I'm as Matt said, I'm Keone Nakoa. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Insular and International Affairs. Born and raised in Honolulu, Nu'uanu to be more precise. I'm very glad to be here, but I'm also glad to welcome two amazing members of the staff at the Office of Insular Affairs. Sorry. First, Charlene Lazier.
Hi,
Uh,
I'm Charlene Lazier. I'm KUNA's Director of Technical Assistance in the Office of Insular Affairs. So we look forward to continuing a partnership with you all, and we hope that the information we can provide today is helpful to all the Native and Indigenous folks in all of our areas. So thank you, KUNA.
And Charlene is doing a lot more of the substantive piece of the presentation, so she's the one that you really want to be hearing from. She really knows these programs. She's been working for years in this office, and has really been a champion for getting great grants out to communities in the insular areas. And the second person on my staff is Tanya Joshua. Can I say hi, Tanya? Tanya.
Kasalelia naing komon karas inan wang ke karas mayang catch nam program and run which will kapten ti ay pilka yang choweta moketen run which halangan ng karusian. My name is Tanya Joshua. I'm in the Department of the Office of Insular Affairs. Very pleased to be working with our new Deputy Assistant Secretary Keone Nakua. I'm the Deputy TAP Director to Charlene is my director. Grateful to be working with her as well. I was born and raised during the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands. So born in the Marshalls, lived in Saipan in the Northern Marianas. But my home island where my dad is from Pohnpei in the Federated States of Micronesia. But I've been in Washington, D.C. for way too long, 20 years, but working on island issues. So glad and pleased to be a part of the Office of Insular Affairs and grateful to be with you today. Thank you.
Mahalo, Tanya, and mahalo for your leadership in just bringing out opportunities to get the Office of Insular Affairs' message out. So I think with that, we can move on. I'm not sure who's controlling the presentation, but next, yeah, mahalo. So as the slide mentions, the U.S. Department of Interior protects and manages the nation's natural resources and honors its trust responsibility or special commitments to the American Indians, Alaska Natives, I should say also Native Hawaiians and affiliated island communities. Just in general, the Interior Department, I didn't know until I kind of joined, it was generally the department where they kind of put all the nascent governmental agencies as they became new parts of government, as more things came up that the United States federal government had to take care of. But I'm very proud to be part of the Department of Interior that does particularly is delegated the responsibility of honoring the trust responsibilities and special relationships with our Indigenous people. Next, yeah, mahalo. Our office, the Assistant Secretary of Insular and International Affairs, comprises three main branches underneath it. As I mentioned, I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary. We are currently, I think, maybe even momentarily awaiting the nomination of the Assistant Secretary, and then underneath us, we sit over three offices: the Office of Insular Affairs, the Office of International Affairs, and then the Ocean, Great Lakes, and Coastal Activities Program. Together, our Assistant Secretary and our political leadership guides the policies of these three offices to complete the mission of the Department of the Interior. As this map shows, there are 7 insular areas that have been specifically carved out by Congress for the Office of Insular Affairs to have responsibility over. And that is going from maybe the left of the map, the CNMI, Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, Guam, and then the 3 freely associated states, the Federated States of Micronesia, Palau, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and then American Samoa, and then all the way on the east side is the US Virgin Islands. It doesn't matter. I was just gonna say that also Native communities in and from the Pacific Insular, there are many Native communities in and from the Pacific Insular areas. There are Native Pacific Islander communities in American Samoa, Guam, and CNMI. There are also Native Pacific Islander communities in all 3 freely associated states, although they are not US citizens. So and when I say Native Pacific Islander, I think that the definition for our office, I should just mention, is much more broad than it is under the ANA statute. So our task, I think, is just much more broad. So we are able to provide funds that in support of the mission of communities throughout the insular areas. So the tie-in is not necessarily as specific as as it is in the Native American programs. There are Native Carolinians in the CNMI who hail originally from the Caroline Islands, now part of the freely associated states. And there are Native Pacific Islander communities from all these insular areas who now reside in Hawaii and the continental United States, including Alaska. So OIA funding has benefited all populations in the insular areas, including Native populations from the insular areas in the United States. And some of the examples of the grantees that we've had in the past are the We Are Oceania group in Hawaii, the Marshallese Education Institute in Arkansas, the Marshallese Young Youth Group in Orange County, California, and NGO in Washington State. Okay, now we can go to the next slide. So this is just a brief org chart of of how the Office of Insular Affairs is broken out. And as I mentioned before, at the top is the Assistant Secretary, which is a Senate confirmed presidential appointment. And then under that is myself, Deputy Assistant Secretary. And then lateral is the Senior Advisor to the Assistant Secretary. I should say those two positions have kind of existed and not existed depending on which administration there is, but happily for the past few administrations, at least, the Assistant Secretary has been there as one of the 6 Assistant Secretaries within the Department of the Interior. Under the political leadership is the Director of the Office of Insular Affairs. Currently, that is Nicolau Pula from American Samoa. And then there are 3 divisions, 3 main divisions within OIA, which is the policy division, technical assistance division, from which Charlene and Tanya come, and then the budget and grants division, which has a Honolulu field office. Next slide. Okay. So this is a pie chart that shows the various allocations of what our OIA activities impacts are. However, at this point, I will hand the baton off to Charlene so that she can kind of show off on her encyclopedic knowledge of OIA's grants programs and all of the great projects that we're able to fund. So Charlene.
Sure. So basically, I want to describe what our programs are. And I know that some of those you may not be able to apply for, but just to let you know the broad range of our projects in the 7 insular areas that Keone mentioned. So our programs include approximately $240 million in discretionary programs that we administer. And part of those I'll get into later include technical assistance and the Coral Reef and Natural Resources program. Those 2 programs are the ones where we may intersect with your program needs. And allowable grantees for those categories are the local governments, nonprofit organizations, and also educational institutions. So, but of our over 600 million that we administer, a large portion of that is mandatory. Over 300 million of that goes to the Compact and Free Association, and those funds are mandated what they're used for. That 300 million goes to the Federated States of Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, and the Republic of Palau. And those include sector grants for education, environment, capacity building, health, and economic development. A large part of our money are mandatory funds. For example, just as a note, we make advance payments to the Virgin Islands for their rum excise taxes on an annual basis. And that is based upon the Virgin Islands sells rum to the United States, and it's manufactured there in the Virgin Islands. It's Cruzio and Diageo, and that proof gallon tax is $13.50 a gallon, and the U.S. Treasury, in accordance with the law, allows the Virgin Islands to keep $13.25 of that $13.50 tax. At the moment, the rate can vary. So that results in revenue that we process to the Virgin Islands of over $300 million a year. Our office also administers the Guam Section 30 income tax collections, and those are taxes for military and federal employees residing in or domiciled in Guam. And that results in financial payments we send to Guam, approximately $80 million a year. You may have heard of this, but more recently, those amounts were offset to make Guam work claims payments to individuals there, including Native and Indigenous folks there, where they use some of that money to pay Guam work claims payments. Our other grant programs that we see here, and I'll let you can move the slide if you like, please. But our other grant payments that we administer include construction payments, infrastructure grants. There's approximately $27 million in mandatory funds in our appropriation that fund infrastructure projects such as building hospitals, schools, power plants, roads, government buildings. And that $27 million is split between the 4 territories that we deal with, which are the U.S. Virgin Islands, the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas, American Samoa, and Guam. We also fund Energizing Insular Communities grants, which are grants that are available to the territories to help improve energy efficiencies and to help shift them towards renewable energies and to help reduce the costs in the insular areas of the cost of power there. This slide here is actually just telling you that our announcements for our discretionary programs are posted on our webpage under press releases, and they are also posted under grants.gov under CFDA 15.875 for application to the programs. And if you could advance the slide, please. And this gives you an idea of the amounts we were talking about earlier. So for technical assistance program, we'll get into the categories of what that can be used for shortly, but the total amount for all 7 areas is $21.8 million. Maintenance assistance covers repair, maintenance, and institutionalizing proper maintenance practices for infrastructure in the insular areas, and that's $4.4 million. The brown tree snake control program, some of you may be familiar with that. The brown tree snake is an invasive species in Guam, and our program, the $3.5 million, covers the civilian side of keeping the snake from spreading from Guam to Hawaii or to CNMI or to other areas. DoD pays the cost to control and manage the snake on the bases. So basically that program funds barriers around ports, airports, and seaports, inspections of cargo with dogs, and it also covers traps to control the snake population there. The Coral Reef and Natural Resources Program, which is right now $2.6 million, is one you all might be especially interested in. And that covers basically coral reef preservation, invasive species protection, and other items like that. The cultural preservation is covered under technical assistance. Cultural preservation can include projects recently that we funded included native mat weaving. We funded in American Samoa. They were losing the skill to be able to build the traditional fale. So we funded a project there where they had someone who constructed it and videotaped it and used the local tools and then trained younger folks there on the island how to do that. And we've also funded through some of our programs, native canoe making out there in the areas. So if you can advance the slide, please. So technical assistance program, as it is currently implemented, you can see here examples of the grants that nonprofits that you might be members of can apply for grants through technical assistance. And it's our broadest category here. And basically technical assistance is meant to provide immediate funds to the insular areas or nonprofits for urgent projects that they need where we don't have to budget ahead of time. They basically give us 21.8 million, and that allows our Deputy Assistant Secretary right now to decide upon the applications we receive to determine the highest priority applications that we receive. Part of that includes, as you can see, capacity building grants and natural and cultural resources management, and also disaster assistance, climate change, energy grants, some of the things we mentioned before, health grants. For example, some of our health projects range from funding training for nurses and doctors to, in one area, nuclear affected atolls in the Marshall Islands, we fund preventative health care and doctors and nurses on the 4 atolls there for the entire population. And then also as part of our training, we also focus on training through technical assistance to help build capacity in the areas. So we get a lot of training applications, and we have some ongoing programs that everyone is eligible for. So Native population, Indigenous people are eligible to participate. And some of those training programs are the Executive Leadership Development Program that we fund through our contract with the Graduate School USA. And that's a 2-year program. And officials in each of the insular areas are eligible to apply. For students, of course, those could be Native and Indigenous students as well. We fund close-up visits to Washington, DC, and they come and learn about civic education, how the government works, how political decisions are made. We also fund Junior Statesmen, which allows college-age students in the areas to take a trip to Washington, DC and participate in a few week classes at different universities here to learn the power of political decision-making. We also fund Coral Fellows program jointly with NOAA and NOVA, which places an intern, a Coral Fellows intern in each of the territories and in other locations to be able to help resolve issues related to the coral reefs there, such as sedimentation and watersheds and diseases related to coral reefs. Slide, please. So this is a slide which basically tells you how to apply or who is eligible. So as I mentioned before, insular area governments, academic institutions, and nonprofit organizations are all eligible applicants if they're doing something that benefits the residents and citizens, Native and Indigenous people in our territories, our 7 areas. And those grants are administered in accordance with normal federal grant regulations, which are 2 CFR 200. So one thing to note here is some smaller nonprofit organizations may not have financial capability. So sometimes when those nonprofit organizations apply, we ask them to find a sponsoring organization for the grant. So they might find a nonprofit that has financial capability to handle that part of the grant. So they might have an awareness of a project that they need to complete and utilize the more advanced nonprofit to help them learn the grants process. We also have recently accepted applications under our technical assistance program from nonprofits and governments to learn grant writing, grant monitoring, grant oversight skills. So anyone who needs grant training, how to apply for grants, how to monitor grants, what the federal regulations are, we're accepting applications related to that category of capacity building. Part of what we have funded also, we funded the one-stop shops, we call them, in Guam and Hawaii, and those are And some of those started where they didn't have financial capability, so they found a partner, and it's been a few years now, and now they're able to request their grants independently. And they serve citizens in Hawaii and Guam that came from the Federated States of Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, or Palau, who need assistance in figuring out how do we get a driver's license, where do we go, what are the regulations, what are the rules, housing and education. So those one stops basically are a one-stop center for those FAS residents to seek assistance. So that's one of the things we provide there, as well as our compact impact funding. Slide, please. And so this is just the slide that announced our capacity building grant that I mentioned under technical assistance. And that again is to see the press release that describes this. It's on OIA's website under www.doi.gov/OIA. And that's where the press releases are. And the grant announcement itself again is at www.grants.gov, CFDA 15.875. Slide, please. And so this is a screenshot from the grants.gov, where I said if you search for 15.875, you can see all of our announcements. So you'll currently see that our technical assistance program announcement is there, our coral reef and natural resources, our brown tree snake program, our maintenance assistance, and our energizing insular communities programs. Our deadlines for most of those grants are April 1st. So definitely take a look at them soon if you're interested in applying. And the reason for the April 1st deadline is because we usually receive our annual appropriations in April or May, and then we start awarding and we continue awarding until they're exhausted, normally in August. So it's important to get those applications in soon. If you miss it this year, though, we open all the announcements normally in October of each year. So there is plenty of time for the next year to apply between October and April. Slide, please. And now, before we go to questions, I want to give Tanya Joshua a moment to add in anything that I might have missed here before we answer questions. Tanya?
Thank you, Charlene. That was kind and so thorough. I just wanted to apologize that we didn't have more images on the slides. That's my fault. But more images to show all the various programs. And she's correct. You can find more information about our office at www.doi.gov/OIA. So thank you so much.
So I guess we will turn it over to your facilitators for questions for us, right?
Yes, thank you so much, Charlene, Tanya, and Deputy Assistant Secretary Nakoa for these super relevant resources. We have, like I said, 12 active grantees, many more previous ANA grantees working in Guam, CNMI, and American Samoa, all of them doing great work, a lot of this work overlapping with the kinds of funding opportunities that you guys have available, the kinds of resources that you're offering. And you're also covering a lot of the areas that are complementary to the work that they're doing, and yet maybe not necessarily priorities in ANA's funding, but definitely a lot of connections that I can see here, even to scale up and sustain some of the projects that our Native community groups are doing in their areas. So thank you for introducing these resources. At this time, we have time for a Q&A. So if you have any questions for our presenters today, please drop them in the chat or the Q&A module, and we will read them for you. And we already have a few questions here in the Q&A module, so I'll read them out loud. And if anyone at our OIA team would like to answer, please unmute yourself and do so. So I'm going to start with a question that came in from CNMI. Wondering if we can get a recorded copy of this webinar to share with our team. Yes, I can answer that one. We'll be sending out the recording of this shortly after it's done today. You'll be able to share that. We can also, you can also share that with your team. And everyone who registered will also receive a recording of today's session if they weren't able to attend. We know it's it's still somewhat early out there in Guam and CNMI. So thank you for joining us. Another question coming from Guahan. Do the TAP grants have periods of performances? Do the TAP grants have a period of performance? Can any of you guys?
I can answer that. This is
Yeah.
Charlene. Yes, our TAP grants normally for technical assistance, we allow 2 to 3 years to complete the project. Depending upon funding, since we're limited in our resources, sometimes people might ask for a lot of money for a 3-year project, but we choose, because the money is appropriated annually, we choose to only fund sometimes 1 year if the project is really expensive. If it's a smaller project, like under $50,000, or we might fund, multiple years, but generally, no matter the award amount, we allow a minimum of 2 to 3 years for the project to be completed.
Thank you, Charlene. Very similar to ANA projects. Most are either 2 or 3 years. Really good information there. So we have another question from Guam as well. Is there a grant funding ceiling or a floor per grant? Maybe we can go back to the list of grants and grants.gov to that slide to frame this.
So we don't usually, they ask you to put a ceiling or a floor, that's great. Yeah, so for technical assistance though, you have to keep in mind, I'll give you an idea of the total amount for each area. So normally for Americans, I think normally you all deal with American Samoa, the Northern Marianas, and Guam, similar to us, right? So for those 3 areas, we usually give them each 2.5 to 3 million a year. So for everything in Guam, including nonprofits and local government, hospitals, schools, we might give them 2.5 million a year. So I don't know if that gives you an idea, but individual projects have ranged from $15,000 to $500,000 or more. It all depends on the project. So we don't do a ceiling or a set ceiling or floor really, because they vary so widely there. And what happens is once we receive all the applications by the deadline, we send the listing of all the government applications we receive and all of the nonprofit applications we receive to the governor. And we ask the governor to priority rank each of those projects so that we know which projects, because normally we receive applications exceeding our funding availability. So we have the governor help us rank them. So it's always good if you have contacts in the governor's office. Letters of support from the governors or other officials in the government are always very helpful for us, and you get additional points in the scoring for those grants that way. And so if you want to see how the grants are scored, that's included on grants.gov. If you go to the end of the announcement, it'll be the meritorious scoring factors and criteria, and the scoring includes things like don't forget a timeline, don't forget a budget section, letters of support gets you additional points. Grants that are in our highest priority areas, which are listed in the applications, get additional points. And of course, natural and cultural resources are one of our highest priorities, as well as climate change and disaster and other things of that nature.
And I would just add in, well, first, mahalo, Charlene, that's great. I would add in, just because if you don't have connections to the governor's offices, still submit. Don't be discouraged. That's not by any means the end all and be all. But I would say, going back to the original question about floors and ceilings, like the larger the project is, the more broad support you would want to justify the larger price tag. Like Janine said, there's only so much amount of money to go around, and we do try to allocate fairly equally. So if there's very significant project that's going to be $1 million, that doesn't mean that we wouldn't be able to fund it, but we would want to make sure that it is universally or very, very popular and important to the insular area, right? And there could even be collaborations across insular areas as well. I believe we've had some. Is that right, Shane? Sorry to put you in the spot. Sorry, Shirley. I was just asking if there was some grants we've had in the past that were there like collaborations between insular areas, correct?
The grants that we've had, which were collaborations between insular areas, grants we have right now include the training that we're doing, the conferences. When we have the conferences, we might fund multiple insular areas at one time for a training conference. So we might provide travel funding for folks to attend a training session from all the insular areas. Pacific lineman training is also a collaboration where we fund Pacific lineman training. Actually, the utility is in the Federated States of Micronesia, YAP, but basically they provide lineman training to the linemen in American Samoa has their own now, but in CNMI and Guam, they also participate, and the other 7 insular areas there in that program. Other grants that involve cross-cutting all the insular areas, as I mentioned before, the close-up, the civic education, the junior statesman grants. So we have a few that are general. We do judicial training in all 7 insular areas, so that crosses boundaries of the insular areas. We partner there with the 9th Circuit, the courts there, to do that program. Other partnerships we have are we partner with our Bureau of Reclamation to do water projects in all the insular areas. We partner with USGS and Fish and Wildlife Service and USDA on our brown tree snake projects. And we partner with US Army Corps of Engineers to do infrastructure assessments of our hospitals, our public infrastructure, including schools. Are those the kind of examples you wanted?
Yeah, that's great. I was just kind of just toying with going on the ceilings, right? I was just and I think what we're looking at the merits and how closely projects align with the priorities that we've set out in this year's priorities. Follow pretty closely with the President Biden's administration-wide priorities, climate change, equity, things like that, in health. So it's more, the more meritorious and more broad support there is, the more just support, more likely it is to have a higher funding amount.
If you back up a couple slides, we can show the priorities were on that sunburst slide, and Keone could, that one. So some of the higher ones for this administration are the health, climate change, natural and cultural resources. I believe we did disaster assistance and public safety and invasive species, right, Keone? And based upon that and what Keone said, when we received the applications, like Keone said, you don't have to have a letter of support to get the extra points. We consider every application that we get, but the ones that are in the priority categories receive additional points. But we consider all of them. So if you have an interest in a project, you're free to email myself or Tanya to find out if it's an eligible project to be applied for, and we could certainly let you know over email if it's something that's eligible under our program.
Right, and we will follow up with that contact information. I know it's available at the website, again, www.doi.gov/OIA, but we'll follow up with your contact information to all registrants as well. And as we look on this slide, it's a good segue to another question that's coming in from a guest from America Samoa, asking about the priorities and needs. This guest has some suggestions for future funding and some priorities, but maybe this could also be an opportunity to talk about how some of these priorities are defined and if there are any opportunities for community members to engage with those, either through a public comment period, through their state and local governments, or some other channels.
So before we get into any additional questions on individuals, Candy, do you want to talk about our IGIA, because that's one of the ways that we incorporate input from the areas?
Sure. So IGIA is the interagency group on insular areas. I keep thinking the G is the governors, but it's not. But anyway, it's an annual conference that the Office of Insular Affairs hosts in Washington, D.C., and where we invite the governors from all of the areas out to have a conversation with the secretary, as well as the White House Intergovernmental Affairs Office. So Julie Chavez Rodriguez, who heads that department, was the co-chair with Secretary Deb Haaland for this year's IGIA, which was held, I believe, was it last month? Days are flying by. But yeah, so that is one way that we really want to make sure that we're listening into the governor and the other elected officials and delegates in Congress about what the priorities are. But also, if I'm going to offer up, if you have thoughts, absolutely, please feel free to email Charlene and her team, because yeah, we can definitely consider various policy priorities. I will say though, like unlike ANA, which has very specific purposes, like SEDS and Esther Martinez, there are various pieces that you have to hit. If not, you will not get funded. Our priorities and our grant in general is just much more flexible. So even if it's not one of the priorities, you can still feel free to submit an application. That being said, the more priorities that you hit, and I think there are a very wide-ranging amount of priorities, as you can see on the slide. So the more you can hit, the more likely it is that it will get funded. But as we've been saying, maybe we missed something, and you have a great idea, and we don't want to be remiss from funding one of those opportunities. So please just submit.
I wanted to add to what Keone said. He's right. We can fund, basically our authorization says that under technical assistance, we can fund anything within the realm of concern for any of the governors in the territories. So if it's something that is of concern to the governor in that area, we can fund it. And basically these categories, there didn't used to be categories 10 years ago when I first came into the division. But what happened is these categories came from the grantees that were applying. And these are the categories they most often applied for that seem to rise to some of our most important levels there. So if the grantees hadn't applied and we didn't have that interaction, we wouldn't even have these priorities today. But normally from the grantees telling us which categories were the most important, and the government's telling us, both of them, the nonprofits telling us. Like I said, we also fund education and training. And so we get a lot of requests for that. And it's any kind of training, from training nurses, training linemen, training financial management, audit training, all kinds of training. And so we learned that from interaction with the Native communities there, and also from the governments there. And that's how we came up with our priorities to begin with. And then what happens is, since our assistant secretaries select the final projects that are going to be awarded, it's also subject to the current administration's priorities. And that's how some of the priorities might rise to the top as seeming more important in the current year. Like now, as you all might be aware, one of our higher priorities is climate change, since that's a very serious priority for the areas and the current administration. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's really exciting. You guys are filling a lot of the not, I wouldn't say gaps, but just filling a lot of complementary services that a lot of our folks need to, pivot into new areas, scale up, sustain their projects. And a lot of them I know are working with their state and local governments in that regard as well. I mean, even when it comes to training, we have some folks who are training young people to manage their marine resources in the Northern Marianas. We have people who are training future farmers in Guam, training health professionals to translate medical jargon to patients. I mean, these are just the projects of some of the participants who are joining us in this room right now. So, and I have time for one last question. I'm gonna take one from the chat here. Does that type of training include wellness and mental health? Is that potentially included in the health priority on this screen or one of the other ones?
If they mean training for hospital or medical clinic staff in that, yes, we normally don't train, private citizens, but we do train health staff members, whether they be in the hospital or local clinics. So yes, we have funded that in the past.
I just also wanted to go back and highlight one new kind of grant area that we did put out a press release on, and Charlene did highlight, but if anyone joined after that, the grant that it's not in its own category, but it would be a TAP grant, and we wanted to highlight the need for grant writing and grant capacity, because there's so much funding that's being pushed out right now through the bill, I forget what it's called, in the infrastructure law, the new infrastructure law. We thought it was really important to make sure that the capacity to grab grants from the insular areas was able to be supported, and then folks could compete with nationally with other groups that are competing for these funds, so FAA grants or whatever, DOT. And so that's why we decided, and Charlene, great idea, was to create this grant to help grant writing. And so, we wanted to make sure that everyone knew that that's available. And I suppose that could also be used for grant capacity to write and apply for ANA grants. And so, it's just a broad category for training. And so, I just wanted to flag that availability.
And as Keone mentioned, that can also be used not only for grant writing, but for learning federal grant regulations or oversight and monitoring grants, because the federal agencies are so strict on that right now. So that includes that as well.
So vital, so vital. Right, we're always about capacity building here, that by the time a grantee is, successfully completes their grant, that their internal capacity is greater than it was when they started. And we have lots of high capacity organizations and also a lot of younger ones who are doing work just as important in their communities. So thank you for that, offering that opportunity. I know we still have a few more questions here in the chat. We will make sure that those get over to our presenters, and we'll seek some answers for you. But we're just about out of time now. So I just want to thank our two presenters today. Obviously, you can see the interest is high here. Lots of really good questions coming in. Lots of active thoughts, reading between the lines. I can see a lot of gears turning, a lot of, new projects forming as we speak. So thank you for lighting those bulbs in this room and just continuing to advocate for our people, for our land, for the indigenous lifeways and cultural resources that are so vital to communities here. Even with climate change, so many of our grantees talk about how indigenous lifeways have been at the forefront of thinking that Western land management and science is just starting to catch up with. And so it's really refreshing to see another agency that we can partner with who is putting Native leadership at the forefront in that way. So thank you, Deputy Assistant Secretary Nakoa, Charlene and Tanya, for your presentation and all these resources, and Deputy Commissioner Hope McDonald-Lonetree for your opening remarks and for hosting this session. So just to close out, here on the screen, I have our Pacific TTA Center contact info. If there's anything about this webinar you have questions about, or just to learn more about ANA's funding opportunities, and to get free technical assistance on applying for ANA grants, feel free to visit our website at anapacific.org or contact us using either the local Hawaii number or our toll-free number there on the screen, or email us at info@kaanani'au.com. Again, our grants are due on March 31st for anyone working on language projects, native language preservation and maintenance and immersion projects, and on April 15th for our SEDS program. That concludes today's session. Mahalo nui for your time. Thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank
Aloha.
you. Mahalo.
Aloha, mahalo.